live. Hello, Global Congress friends. Welcome to this main trade event on global trade agenda in a post-COVID-19 world. I see some familiar names there. Hello, old friends, and also hello to new friends. This is the first main event on trade, and there will be a follow-up session on trade and access to medicines tomorrow afternoon. And in this session, we're going to focus on general issues, like general IP issues, mostly copyright and digital trade. And we have a really great panel, the panel of rock stars. So it's a great honor to moderate this panel, and all these panelists are longtime colleagues, allies, and friends. And we have 1 hour 45 minutes, but I want to wrap up in a little bit earlier than that, because it's quite late in Nairobi and London, and it's also Javier's birthday today, so he needs to have a birthday party. So we'll wrap it up early, but if you have questions, and please write them on the chat, and we'll have an interactive discussion, so there won't be any presentations. We will be just discussing the global trade agenda, and each panelist will will tell us what's happening in their regions. So speaking of panelists, as I said, we have a panel of rock stars, and our main rock star, Lori Wallach. She's a colleague of mine. She's a good friend, a trade guru, a mentor. And back in 2018 at Global Congress, we organized a training for digital trade participants. And Lori was there, and she gave a 1 hour lecture on trade and trade agreements. And after the Congress, we asked the participants about the sessions, and everyone was like, we want to hear more from Lori. It was so great. So we heard you. Lori is here, and I'll start with Lori, and I'll ask you, Lori. So what's happening in terms of trade? Because the trade agenda is moving fast, and in the beginning of the pandemic, everyone thought that things will slow down, and things were slowed down for maybe a month or so, but now we know that it's going really fast, and everything is happening like this. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Washington, D.C.? What are the plans of the United States Trade Representative? We know that US is currently negotiating a free trade agreement with Kenya and the United Kingdom, but there are also other things moving on really fast. So you can tell us a little bit about that. Lori.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for including me. I'm going to be learning a lot from the other panelists, but to give a little bit of information about sort of the context, this session doesn't sort of do the basics of how people who care about IP-related issues for access to information or access to medicines basically are having their work directly impacted by trade agreements, not just the actual intellectual property chapters, but other provisions in the trade agreements, which is what we talked about a couple of years ago. But if there needs to be any more of a wake-up call, I would just say, consider that right now in the middle of the global COVID epidemic, just now, South Africa and India have had to file a waiver to be able to try and escape the handcuffs in the WTO's intellectual property rules with respect to having technology accessible for not just vaccines, but given a lot of them are biologics, the technology needed to make the vaccines that are biologics. And literally, millions of lives around the world are going to rely, obviously there are many issues about universal access, but the notion that there is a global trade agreement that's supposed to be about free trade that is imposes the barrier of monopoly licensing as a condition before not just the vaccines, but for that matter, a variety of treatments and all of the other medicines that are needed for supportive care of people who have COVID-19 can be accessible at the cheapest rate. The fact that there is a free trade agreement stepping in the middle of that is emblematic of the ways in which the trade and the intellectual property access to information and medicines agendas overlap. So what is happening in the US, I would say, is that the US trade model is shifting. And there are three reasons why that are worth keeping in mind. This was happening before COVID, but COVID's a big part of it. But the two things that were happening before are, one, the way in which a rising China has really shifted the political economy of trade issues in the US. The sort of corporate elite consensus around liberalization is always best, get government out of the process, et cetera, has basically been smashed into a bunch of small bits by seeing China with a very government involved model of how an economy runs, using all kinds of interventionist tools, having that their regime then work within a regime that ostensibly is free market, and all of the externalities, to put in economics terms, that have resulted, which has caused the political shit to hit the fan domestically in the US and have trade job loss become a huge issue in trade deficits, but also just practically around the world, a lot of developing countries are seeing themselves pushed out of potential export markets by what is becoming increasingly Chinese domination and Chinese export domination in a lot of different sectors, which then gets to the second phenomenon. So just both geopolitical troops and thinkers, but also people in the trade sphere in the US have shifted about just notionally how much government involvement there needs to be to make trade work. Then there is the COVID epidemic, which for many Americans was a horrific wake-up call. That thanks to this model of hyperglobalization, here we are in the richest country where we have the privilege normally of not having to worry about shortages and supplies of things. And we could not get or make the most basic things we need to keep our mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and colleagues and friends alive and safe from getting the infection. And for a lot of Americans, that was a enormous shock, but it made people start to think about the 90,000 production facilities, factories, that the US no longer has, that we had before the WTO NAFTA era, and just both the vulnerability supply chain wise, but also then it started to feed into the idea of the climate implications of all that long distance schlepping of stuff, of having production happening in just one or two places. And in medicines particularly, I think there has been a real wake-up call where the whole world, not just the US, is highly reliant on India and China with respect to medicine supplies and with respect to China for APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. And separate from it being any particular country, just the notion of, as we've seen, if some part of the world or a country or a region gets knocked off of production, how a global crisis of access can emerge. And so then, a lot of countries are thinking about not just the need to have some more domestic production of certain things, but just diversifying imports. And, that's like a remedy against the countering of all the mergers that have happened in the pharmaceutical industry where just capacity has been thrown out. So that is that. And then the third thing is the Trump administration came in and basically broke all the China. And they undid the FTA model with a piece of the new NAFTA, throwing out sacred cows, investor state dispute resolution, putting in something closer to enforceable labor standards, putting in really tight rules of origin. They put 25% tariffs on $300 billion of imports from China. They did a bunch of other stuff, and alas, the earth did not hurl into the sun. There wasn't a global depression. There was not autarky. cats lie down with dogs and actually rested. So we actually have a scenario where the things that you could not possibly think about doing because it would be the end actually happened and nothing happened. That was so dramatic. So with that as the context, I would just say the US trade, both policy and politics, is permanently shifted. And now there is this perverse race of whether there will be UK and, more worryingly in a way, Kenya FTA agreement that locks in some of the stuff that is just not going to be viable. That may not be viable right now, but because everyone is basically hunkered down in the US with the election, et cetera, and not paying attention, there is this sort of race by certain sectors to try and get an agreement, where I think with respect to the UK and the Kenya agreements, there is way more room for negotiators in those countries to be able to say, for Kenya, no, we're just not going to have a full-scale FTA. If you want to give us a deal that's better than what we already have with the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, then here are the specific things where there are real comparative advantages. Here are things we're just not going to have in this agreement. We're not going to have XYZ chapters, etc. And with respect to the UK, similarly, I think there's more leverage with some of the issues around digital trade, which in the Kenya agreement, I think can just be a chapter that does not exist. But with respect to the UK, I think there's a lot more, there are a lot of moving parts. So I would just sum up by saying that we saw with the USMCA, the revised NAFTA, which passed with stunning margins of Democrats and Republicans in Congress, like unprecedented numbers, that there's never going to be an agreement that has full investor state dispute settlement, which is really good, given we have seen, some of the cases where IP implicated corporate attacks on governments, and countries no longer need to feel that that needs to be part of an agreement. We already had the empirical data that having ISDS didn't actually create more foreign direct investment if you signed up for it. So now the political pressure from the US to do that again is off. As well, it is the case that within a week's breath, things like the liability waiver that was in the revised NAFTA and some of the stuff having to do with a mandatory free flow of data versus, the US president just did data localization. TikTok, that's data localization. We have many members of Congress from the Democrats who are doing privacy stuff where they don't realize that while on one hand, they're over here doing that, over here, the trade policy is about to rip that out from under them and handcuff them so they can never go back and do it. So there is, and with the trade secret stuff, for instance, with respect to algorithms, there's a whole, both Justice Department and congressional holy beans, we don't believe that's happening right now, we got to fix that, move. And yet again, the cement's about to get poured in a trade agreement to try and take that away. So there is a lot that obviously the Trump folks did that is different, but with digital trade and some IP related stuff, it's only been because Congress said under no circumstances. The USMCA had to be renegotiated a second time over IP. So the dynamic folks should know in other countries is this election is going to make that Democratic House majority that already did that the first time even bigger. And there's a chance that this election will have the Democrats also take control of the Senate. And so, the polling looks like Biden is likely to win, but even if he doesn't, the Congress is of a view where a bunch of the things that have been in the old model are no longer acceptable. You have more room. And in fact, some of those things have to be changed or won't get through Congress relative to the old extreme pharma model, et cetera. The thing to be heads up about with Biden, though, is there are a lot of people around the Biden world who come from the digital lobby. So from Facebook, from Google, et cetera. So while I think the IP medicines issues are changed in a way where future US presidents serve regardless, absent a total Republican takeover of both houses of Congress and the Republican president and all of them being very kumbaya with pharma, are not going to go back to the extreme in meds IP. Not that it's fixed 100%, but it's better. I do think the digital space is a space where countries really are going to need to push back fiercely because to some degree, regardless of who's going to be the president coming forward, they're not necessarily in the right position on this stuff, even though Trump is acting in ways. He's tweeting against Section 230 liability waivers. He is doing data localization. But as is often the case with the Trump administration, what the right hand is doing, the left hand has no damn idea there is a right hand, much less what it's doing. So the congressional push on this is strong and growing, and it's bipartisan. There are equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans who don't want a liability waiver for the tech platforms, who are worried about transfer, the Republicans because of national security, the Democrats because of consumer privacy. But that area is, I think, more treacherous, and it hasn't played out like with USMCA, where an agreement signed in 2018 was shoved up Trump's nose, and he had to go renegotiate it to get it through Congress. That lesson has not been heard with respect yet to the digital issues. So I would just leave it there as sort of the lay of the land. I think, if Biden is elected, there will certainly be an attempt by trade team status quo for a restoration of the 2015 era of trade. I think that's not likely to be viable, both because where Congress is, but also just politically, they've sort of got it. So some of the USTR candidates who'd be likely suspects for Biden administration are just ruled out because they are so associated with that failed status quo. The most dangerous place where that, will have limitations is digital, and certainly it will be a fight.
Thank you, Lori. And I took some notes, but in there was one thing interesting you mentioned. The countries should push back. So let's go to those countries. Currently, U.S. is negotiating an agreement, a free trade agreement with Kenya and the United Kingdom. So from Washington, D.C., we'll go to Nairobi and ask Isaac. So is there a pushback from Kenya? Or what's happening? What's happening in terms of the US FDA? Because this is it will be the first US free trade agreement in the region, and the USTR is considering it as a template for other FTAs in the region. So can you tell us a little bit what's happening in Nairobi?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, good morning, afternoon, evening for everybody. I'm here in Nairobi. Sorry about the lighting. It's just the best I could do. And so I'm here feeding the mosquitoes, which are out in force in the evening here. But we are actively watching the politics in the US, the politics and trade and around trade and all that. Mike Pompeo tweeted today, I don't know if you saw what he said, but he said Africa needs to hold fair and free elections, otherwise there will be repercussions of some kind, which I thought was really, was just precious. So anyway, we're enjoying the politics out here. It's quite engaging and entertaining. But they have up, as we heard from Lori, and I would just actually prefer to listen to Lori for the rest of the time here, but I guess I can talk about what's going on in Kenya right now. We are in the middle of negotiations for a free trade agreement, which honestly really shouldn't be happening at all, because we're also in negotiations for the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So a bilateral agreement in the context of a continental agreement, it's not really very clear how those two would work. And in fact, there have been pretty loud objections by our regional neighbors to say, why are you even doing this? But so the Americans went first to South Africa, as I understand, and were essentially turned away mostly over IP issues, I think. So they looked for another partner, or another victim, or no, I mean another partner to do a free trade agreement, and lo and behold, here we are, Kenya. So we got the distinction, and the negotiations are underway, as I understand. A little bit of background is probably helpful. Kenya has just passed a Data Protection Act. It's one of actually a pretty large and growing number of countries in Africa that have Data Protection Acts. the majority of them are modeled after or look very similar to GDPR, and Kenya's looks quite similar. It's not exactly the same. It's been contextualized a little bit, but the basics are very similar to GDPR. So one of those provisions, of course, under GDPR and in Kenya is you cannot send data outside of Kenya unless it is to a jurisdiction that has equivalent data protection laws in place, which of course is not the United States. So there's that bit of tension, which is almost certain to become a negotiating point or a point of real interest in the United States to somehow get around that limitation. Kenyan data, you might wonder, why is Kenyan data important to the United States? Well, we actually have some really interesting data sets, one, and two, of course, as has been said, the Kenyan Free Trade Agreement, should it happen, would become the standard, the model for any other free trade agreement in Africa. So if they can get free trade of free flow of data out of Kenya, then it almost certainly will happen across the continent. What kind of data do we have, you might ask? If you have ever used Venmo, we were a decade ahead of you on that. We've been doing mobile money transfer for a very long time. And the main company doing that, Safaricom, has so much data on the purchasing habits and the just basically the habits and travel locations and the people you visit and people you interact with. The data in that alone is unbelievable and could paint the most incredible and detailed pictures of consumers, far beyond. Well, I mean, it's like Google level data of your behaviors. So I think that it's actually probably, although it's a very small market by itself, Kenya, I think that our mobile money, well, and of course that's spread across much of Africa. So mobile money data is, I'm sure, very interesting to American companies. So the U.S. has essentially said in its negotiating objectives that it wants to ensure that we do not impose measures that restrict cross-border data flow. That's literally in their objectives. And yet, on the Kenyan side, the strategy is to improve or call for data localization. And also, to get data centers, more prevalent data centers in the country. We actually have data centers being built right now. One major data center is going up about 60 kilometers outside of Nairobi, in a city that is being built. I'm sure there are a lot of these projects across Africa. I've actually drove by this city a couple of weeks ago, and there is one building there, but I think that's where the data center is. So there is actually progress on this data localization, and Kenya has expressed it numerous times. It's actually in the Data Protection Act that we have, that certain things ought to be on localized data. So that is definitely a source of tension. The last thing I'll say really is that, well, kind of going back to the issue of data through our mobile money, is that mobile money is a component of e-commerce. We don't have a very active e-commerce in the sense of an Amazon type online transaction world space, but we have a little bit of that, but we have mostly e-commerce through mobile money and that sort of platform. However, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has definitely highlighted e-commerce as a source of growth, or a target for growth. And there's a goal to realize a single digital market by 2023 under the African Union. So it's definitely something that they are very heavily focused on. The free trade agreement negotiations have the phase one has finished and been adopted and went into force in May of 2019. It did not touch on e-commerce. It did not touch on intellectual property either. Those are actually going to happen in phase two negotiations, which are now scheduled, I think they were delayed because of COVID, and are now scheduled to begin early next year. So in the meantime, Kenya will be doing their own negotiations on these very same topics with the Americans. So it's very unclear how those things will mesh, if they will at all. So that's the scoop from Nairobi, and I'm sure there will be time for further discussions. But back to you.
Yes, Isaac, I have a very important question for you, but I'll keep that because you mentioned, I mean, your last point was very important. But I'm going to ask that question after we hear from Santiago, from Pablo in Chile. But before we go to Santiago, I want to go to London and ask Javier, what's happening in the UK? Brexit, UK, EU, US, UK. It sounds like there is a mess there. So tell us a little bit about what's happening in London.
Yeah, so basically here, everything is about Brexit in many ways, although of course now COVID, is the top, but Brexit is the subtext for everything that the UK is doing. And to understand, I mean, really what the UK is trying to do is that the idea is to try to build the flexibilities and try to pivot in trade away from the EU and towards the US and the Asia Pacific region. And that includes data and selling many more services. And then the truth is that the trading goods, in the past 6-7 years has been in diversifying, a bit away from the EU, but when it comes to services, still not that much. The UK wants to have the best of everything. And that I think is something that people want to understand. They want to have the US business freedom and deregulation, and the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, which is part of, it has been presented at least by certain people as the national identity, the Britain is business. Then they also, the new government, interestingly, they also want to have the Chinese level of strategic state intervention and support for AI and being able to pick up industry. And that is actually creating a huge conflict with the European Union at the moment. And then of course, we also want to have like a world-class European level data protection standards. But, obviously innovation will come first. And I think, and some people think that actually if anything has to give in all these things, probably data protection would be the first thing to go. So what this means, is that the UK is going to be caught or part of this global geopolitical tech war, that we are seeing with China and the US, for different models of regulating technology. The UK wants to be an independent player, so, not just, but ultimately is quite close to the US. It's part of something that is coming up, surprisingly, that it came to the fore at the time of the Snowden leaks, which is the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which is something not many people knew about, but is that basically the US, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada have been sharing deep level intelligence since the end of Second World War. And surprisingly, that is now taking a huge importance when it comes to the technology regulation. Because basically all these people know that their tech, they can spy on each other, but if they cannot spy, I mean, they cannot use Chinese tech to control technology, to understand it. So that is a big conflict. And of course, the UK is now dealing with two, in that context, dealing with two parallel fronts, the EU and the US. So with the EU, I mean, the situation is a proper mess, really. I mean, no one knows exactly what's going to happen, whether it's just brinkmanship, pushing things to the end, or just simply that things are falling, are falling apart. But there was, you may have heard that there was a political, well, an actual agreement, a withdrawal agreement. The UK seems to be pulling out of some of those things that they have already agreed. The European Union has actually started formal legal proceedings against the UK for breach of the treaty. But in fairness, the EU has breach of proceedings against many countries and member states for tons of things. So it's not clear whether that is so serious. But when it comes to digital trade, the EU and the UK agree on quite a few things. Algorithms, e-commerce, both are against localization. There is absolutely no agreement on platform regulation and Section 230 of the Computer Decency Act in the US, and that is something where the EU is really trying to move like quite strongly on platforms, Digital Services Act and things, and the UK is going possibly in another direction. So that is not in the discussion. And of course, the big point of contention is data flows and data protection, where the EU is trying to protect the European model and has got a very clear regime for how these things are dealt with in trade through some model clauses. And the UK is going to the table pretty much copy-pasting the provisions in the USMCA and the TPP and proposing that to Europe as the future relationship. So it's like interoperability of different types of data protection regimes, including private undertakings, of course, everyone, and free flow of data. And that seems very unlikely for the EU. Now, separately from trade discussions, we have the GDPR, what's called GDPR adequacy, which is how the European Union, the European Commission, decides that some countries have a good level of an adequate level of data protection and data can transfer freely. Now, the UK has assumed that they would have adequacy because the current legal system is the same as in the EU, more or less. But now it's becoming a bit unclear whether that is going to be the case. There was a recent ruling on the called Schrems case where the EU-US data flow regime for some companies, Privacy Shield, was declared illegal in grand part because of the government surveillance on US platforms. And when you look at the surveillance regime of the UK, which is pretty much like a symbiotic or a satellite of the US regime, it's quite difficult to see how that would not be the case for the UK as well. I mean, there are a few differences, but there is now consensus that the adequacy decision is likely that it may not happen. And that, of course, would throw like a massive spanner in the works of the relation. So it's, a very, very tricky situation from the EU and the UK. Now, when it comes, this is all separately from IP. IP, and we are in an IP space. There are IPs being negotiated. There will be some divergences. The big divergence at the moment, before Brexit, that is already happening, is that the UK has agreed that they are not going to implement the Digital Copyright Directive. And that is this quite controversial legislation from the European Union that created press and ancillary press right, where if a news aggregator wanted to basically copy part of the news, they have to pay, or they should negotiate with the publisher. And then also very, very controversially, some provisions to control user content, what's called to close the value gap, which is basically the money that YouTube makes from user-generated content and the money that goes to creators. So the European Union has created a bit of legislation to try to force YouTube and other platforms to pass some of that money to rights holders. It's not very clear whether that is really going to work or not. Certain platforms, actually many platforms, are going to be caught by not just YouTube, by these provisions. They have to try to take down content, but that right holders have said that it's infringing, but also, very importantly, they have an obligation, some platforms, those with more than 5 million visitors, they have an obligation to prevent re-uploading. So it's the take down and stay down. No one really knows how this is going to work. Every country is implementing a different version. What we know is that Google already has this kind of systems in place, but for a new company, it may be quite hard to implement. There are other things in terms of the future of Brexit and IP, but in general, apart from trademarks, there shouldn't be like huge disruption. Then we jump to the US, and in the US, there is, this is generating quite a lot of debate in the UK, mainly focused on food and health. The fears that US health companies, but everyone knows that if you don't have health insurance, basically you die in the street. and they're worried that they will try to come to the NHS to push up the price of medicines, which is capped in the UK, you know, and that is, I mean, it's a very genuine concern, because obviously that is the interest of the US to export agricultural products, like, you know, here the caricature image is the chlorinated chicken, you know, but also to take over the NHS, including the data of NHS patients. So that is the big debate. And when it comes to digital trade itself, there is both sides seem to be agreeing. It's almost like a game of one-upmanship. You know, the UK wants to be more ambitious, and they want to go further than anyone and have the most ambitious trade agreement, but unclear what ambitious really mean. But it's almost like it becomes an end in itself to be the biggest when it comes to trade liberalization. Now, of course, as it was said before, like in the US, there is a conflict between free trade and wanting to pick up sides and, you know, and having more interventionist economy. But the UK really thinks that, you know, like at the moment, you know, liberalization is going to be for the best, forgetting that at the other side, you know, when it comes to the US, the UK is on the receiving end of the stick, is the smaller player. And in all my discussions with UK trade people, policy makers, they don't really gather that two sides, you know, that yeah, when versus smaller countries, the UK may be the winner, but when it comes to the US, you know, it is at the bottom. So that is really like what they're trying to get. I mean, the UK really is proposing the free flow of data, trying to figure out more interoperability of data regimes. At least that's what they propose to the EU, and that's what they are discussing with Japan. And and I think that the idea is that the UK should be a kind of a global data hub and technology hub, and like a very innovative place, something like mix of Silicon Valley and Singapore, you know, with European data protection somehow, which of course is quite is going to be quite tricky. The one area where there seems to be some divergence between the UK and the US is platform liability. And that is, again, you know, one area where the UK is pushing, you know, a bit back against the US. But again, it's not clear how much that is going to be the case if there are changes in Washington in terms of platform liability themselves. Then when it comes to IP, there have been many discussions, mainly on enforcement around where the UK actually seems to have even some more advanced things, like, for example, open injunctions for ISPs, you know, and also the access to user data, to subscriber data from ISPs, and voluntary takedowns, you know, where you get the registrars to take down a website without a court order. And that's something that from leaked documents, the US trade policymakers are very jealous of, you know, because they don't need to go and get a warrant. So there's quite a lot of interest, and actually it's working both ways. You know, the one area where there is a conflict is when it comes to trade secrets. The US is really pushing for criminal sanctions. The European regime doesn't really work like that, and it's a bit unclear whether the UK will give in. I mean, it's totally, I mean, not totally clear, but in everything else, you know, I think that I think the UK seems to have already quite a strong copyright regime, but they could try to import some of the US provisions, you know, but it would be mainly around trade secrets, and I think that's probably quite more, you know.
Thank you, Javier. This was a really great overview of what's happening in the UK in terms of like the US, UK, and UK-EU free trade agreements. I have questions for you too, but before I start with my questions, I want to go to Santiago, because there is this country just down there in Latin America, Chile, and I think Chilean example is a very very interesting interesting example. Chile has an FTA with the US. When did you sign the Chilean FTA? Probably 2005 or something like that, right? Yeah, 2005. And most of our like attendants are from Latin America, and you know, like you are familiar with Chilean politics. They are very libertarian, and but something interesting with Chile was part of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. It's nowadays called CPTPP. And when US withdrew from the TPP, thanks to the amazing work the US civil society, Lori, and our allies did here, TPP countries suspended certain provisions, like certain IP provisions, which we all fought against, like especially on patents and copyright. But the countries, the TPP countries, and now they're CPTPP countries, they kept the e-commerce chapter. At that time, it was called e-commerce. And it turned out to be that they are so proud of that chapter, and they haven't only kept the chapter, they own it now. Like they think that as their baby. So Chile is very interesting because post TPP, Chile signed free trade agreements with countries in the region, but also it took the lead and signed this agreement. It's not a free trade agreement, it's more of a partnership agreement, digital economic partnership agreement with New Zealand and Singapore. So Pablo has been following the developments very closely. I want to give the floor to Pablo. He can tell us what's happening in Chile, and listen this carefully, because like I will then ask questions to Isaac and Javier, and we can all use the Chilean example, and we can learn from the Chilean example. Pablo.
Hey everyone, thanks a lot for the invitation and the opportunity to present my vision on these trade agreement issues related to e-commerce and trade agreements negotiations. So I think that the phenomenon that Burcu is describing is part of something that is happening not only in Chile, but in several countries of Latin America. And it's something that I would define as a regulatory dissonance. And something that we are seeing in many countries of Latin America is that at an internal level, because data protection is such a huge issue, and in later years has been a big theme of discussion in the public sphere, and countries are realizing how important is to strengthen their regimes of data protection. At the national level, a lot of countries in Latin America, such as Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, are negotiating or are discussing at their parliament, at the Congress, very robust schemes of data protection that are very similar to the model that is today present in the European Union. But at the same time, the same governments, other branches of those governments that are the ones in charge of negotiating trade agreements, are negotiating these multilateral or bilateral trade agreements that are indirectly regulating issues that are related to data protection, but from a very different approach. At some point, those two different regimes are going to clash. And I think that is very interesting. So I think that has two main reasons. First, there's a development issue, and you guys that are activists in themes regarding to intellectual property know better than anything, because intellectual property is one of the biggest problematics that have been impacted by international agreements since last century. And I don't know much about that. I think I know that there's development issues and there's trade-offs. So countries are willing to lower the level of protection to data protection in the same logic that they are willing to increase the protection to intellectual property for the trade-off of lower tariffs on things that we export as Latin American countries, such as wood, fish, and primary elements. But there's also an issue that I think is related to the conception of personal data that is involved. And it's the fact that the Anglo-Saxon conceptualization of data protection is very different from the continental, from the European and Latin America conceptualization of data protection. Americans have a tendency to think of data protection as something that you own. And even activists in the United States, which I respect and I value their job, try to give power to users, to empower users, saying we need data ownership. We need people controlling their own data. But in Latin America, we have a very different approach. And I think that is a human rights approach. And we don't think data as an personal data, as an object that we own, a property. The link between the person and the data is not ownership. Because if it was ownership, well, then you could sell your data, or you can rent your data, or you could give your data away for free. And if you sell something, or you rent something, or you give it away, you cannot take it back. You cannot control it back, because that's a contract from the law perspective. But in Latin America and in Europe, we think of data as a nexus of titularity, as a characteristic of people's persona as itself. So the link between the person or the user and its data cannot ever be broken. And you see that in data protection legislation. You can consent from the use of your data, but you always have the right to take away that consent. And you always have the right to cancel your data, and you always have the right to access your data, and you always have the right to block your data. Even if you sign a paper saying that I give away my data, I rent your data, I sell your data. So it's a human rights approach. And this is where these concepts clash, because propositions regarding issues such as cross-border data flows, data localization, and other norms included in free trade agreements that Burcu described, have been pushed by the United States under the conception that data protection or that personal data is something that people own, and there's no problem with any kind of processing or recollection of the data, while people only consent. And you can see that in the United States, that the United States has a very low level of protection for intellectual for data protection, because they operate in this liberal idea that meanwhile people consent, there's no problem. Of course, we know that's not true, because there are information asymmetries, there are power asymmetries. So this approach kind of contradicts the way that the European Union has implemented data protection legislation, and the way that Latin American countries at the local level are trying to advance to more robust regimes of data protection. And it's very ironic because, as Burcu said, the United States retired itself from TPP, or whatever it's called now. But those provisions remained, and countries such as Chile included those provisions in other trade agreements that they negotiate at the Latin American level, and those provisions came into effect before TPP came into effect. So I just told you that Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil are having discussions at the local level about data protection. But Chile has free trade agreements with Brazil and Ecuador. And guess what? That same provision that says that countries must allow the transfer of data of personal data, and only have very narrow exceptions for that obligations, are inside the Brazil and the Ecuador free trade agreements. The European Union doesn't allow those sorts of norms, because they have another approximation. They say, because data protection is a human right, we only allow information regarding EU citizens to countries that we have certified that have a adequate level of data protection. And for example, when Chile negotiated its trade agreement with Argentina, Argentinians didn't allow for the provision regarding TPP. And they created an ad hoc version because Argentinians want to have the certification from the EU certificating that they have an adequate level of data protection. So that's the main thing that I wanted to transmit, that there's an ongoing dissociation or regulatory dissonance at Latin American level on how, on one side, countries are advancing at the local level on the EU approach and making robust schemes of data protection, but at the same time, at the international level, they are negotiating free trade agreements that include provisions that go exactly on the other direction. Thanks you.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Pablo. This is a very great example. And Isaac, I told you that I will come back to you because one of your concluding remarks was like, you know, Kenya is negotiating a African Continental Trade Agreement. So the phase one completed, and now they're going to start phase two on IP and e-commerce. But in the meantime, Kenya is negotiating a free trade agreement with the US, and it will possibly be completed before the phase two starts, or it will be like the same time. So do you expect like Kenya to take the Chilean like lead and include the US FTA provisions in African Continental Free Trade Agreement in phase two? Because the experience shows us that the countries, once they sign on to these provisions, they really own those provisions. Like they feel like these are all provisions now, and we should get more countries to agree on these provisions. Can we expect the same kind of approach from Kenya?
I think probably yes. I think that. And this is totally an opinion based on circumstantial interactions with the people, government and even private citizens here. I think that there's a sense that, well, with respect to intellectual property, I think it's unclear whether there will be an IP chapter in any of the, in the US-Kenya Free Trade Agreement. But if there is one, I think that actually at the moment, Kenyan government and negotiators are probably would be in favor of stronger intellectual property protections. In which case, if that happens, it's unclear how that would translate over to the Africa Free Trade Agreement at all. But I think that Kenya is probably a net exporter of ideas on the continent, but would be a net importer of ideas with respect to the United States. So I think it would be a very interesting. It would be a very interesting dynamic when Kenya has an interest in having stronger intellectual property protections, even though it hurts them in the long run with the United States. They might push for it in the continental trade agreement, and then it becomes sort of a Kenyan thing. So that's my sense. I mean, I could be totally wrong, but that's the sense I've gotten.
I see Lori's hands up. Like, Lori, do you have a question for Isaac?
Can I just share that I think that there is room to be able to have Kenya say we don't want an IP chapter, and it's a new model. The Trade Representative's Office has said this is an attempt to figure out a model for countries in Africa that already have duty-free access because of a preference program we have. So the idea is not to come up with a free trade agreement that puts the African countries in a worse situation. And the imposition of these inflexibilities certainly would be a new imposition in exchange for what? Like what can you pay with, given you're already duty free? So there are all these impositions that are being requested of Kenya, but the actual thing that can be compensated is hard to imagine because Kenya already has duty free market access. And the second thing with respect to just Kenya is, and this goes, I think, to Isaac's point about why the hell are they doing this negotiation in the first instance, it's all built in a myth. And the myth is something that President Pinocchio Trump came up with during a visit with the president of Kenya, which is he warned, look out, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is the preference program that provides duty-free market access for African countries into the US beyond what is in the generalized system of preferences. Look out, that's going to go away. Well, first of all, it's in place until 2025. So heaven forbid that Trump is reelected. Absent a literal military coup, the man is not going to be in government at the time that the African Growth and Opportunity Act decision gets made. So not only is it not his damn business, because Congress does that, but the dude's not going to be around to veto it, which is in our system, a president can basically act something and Congress has to have a supermajority. That's not even a viable option constitutionally, because even if he is around for the next 4 years, in 2025, the man's not going to be in a position, absent there being a circumstance here that's much worse than whether AGOA goes up or down, to be in a position to veto. So the reality is, because when I heard that news that President Kenyatta had been told by Trump, AGOA is going away, to the extent anyone is talking about AGOA in Congress, they're talking about an early renewal. There is no discussion. There is zero chance. It is not happening that AGOA is going away. It may get renewed early. There may be in this 10-year grant a graduation program that maybe wouldn't even catch Kenya, but might catch Nigeria and South Africa, which is over a period of time. If you have X percentage of trade, then you don't get all the benefits, but it ain't going away. So to the extent that there's a sort of Damocles been hung over Kenya about do this or else, and then that stands to contaminate the whole continental FTA, the first thing to do is to puncture the myth.
Well, okay, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, but in terms of IP, I also think that like there is a room for us to push for no IP chapter. But I went through all the submissions, the comments submitted to the USTR on US-Kenya FTA. There is one thing clear: digital trade is a top agenda item, and that's my concern for the region, especially in Africa, because we can expect Kenya doing what Chile has been doing all these years, like, going around signing the bilateral trade agreements or putting all these US provisions in African continental agreement. And I know that African countries are really invested in data protection. So that's a worry for me, because Chile is a really big problem in Latin America. And now like USTR is creating another problem in Africa, which will be Kenya.
Just to add to that, yeah, which is, if you look at what Kenya posted as its negotiating agenda, it looks like something that the trade representative in the US could have written, which it replicates a lot of exactly those things that are not in Kenya's interest. So when I saw that, I immediately said, oh, good Lord, it's got to be a bunch of World Bank consultants or someone else advising the Kenya team who have done a brain transplant about what the neoliberal model is versus what's actually useful for Kenya. So your point is well taken. It's going to take work in Kenya, which is outside of my knowledge of whether that's doable, to break through some of these problems.
Isaac.
Well, yeah, just to put a fine point on that, I think it's actually a source of pride to some degree that Kenyans feel, oh, we're important enough to be negotiating a bilateral trade agreement and no one else is here. So we must be, it's not something that you have widespread dissent over. And the second point is, yeah, we're kind of proud of our Data Protection Act to the extent that anyone in Kenya knows that it exists. It's not yet implemented. We don't have a data protection commissioner yet. And so we haven't really gotten used to having data protection, and to have it pulled away from us, and with that in that respect over a trade deal, I don't think anyone would miss it really yet. So they wouldn't even know what they're missing, I think. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done, and I think it is a huge uphill battle to turn that. So I'm not exactly sure the best approach at all, actually, to be in opposition to it.
Yeah.
That's why we have experts like you guys.
Yeah, but we have like people like you on the ground. And I'm going to ask the same question to Javier, because Javier made it clear in his opening remarks that UK want to take the lead. I know, interesting enough, UK and Kenya are also negotiating a free trade agreement. So So UK already did that. They put the USMCA provisions in their European in their proposals to the European Union. So Javier, what's your take on the UK? And then after you, I'll go to Lori, because I think some of this information is new to Lori, and I'll ask her reading of the landscape, because lots is happening. It's not, and we usually pay attention to the US FTAs or the WTO, and there is also WTO e-commerce going on, joint statement initiative, but we haven't been paying attention to the small FTAs that Chile has been signing, and US-Kenya FTA, or like the other ones that the countries in other regions. Unfortunately, we can't have anyone from Asia, because much is happening in Asia because of the time zones. it's already night there. Otherwise, we could have invited one of our Asian partners to join us, but the time zones didn't work. So, Javier, what's your take on that? You heard about what Chile has been doing. And it sounds like Kenya would be the African Chile in the region after the US FTA. So what's your take on that?
I think that in a way the UK is the European Kenya as well. I mean, I think that what you can see is that the idea of getting one country to adopt certain certain policies, like and then hope that that is going to change, like to have an influence in neighboring countries. I mean, that has been pretty much almost openly discussed in in some of the leaked documents, that we've seen between the US and the UK. I mean, that the US negotiators have said very openly that they don't think that, for example, the adequacy regime of the European Union is the way to go, and that you need to have a more flexible regime. There's this idea of having interoperability. So I think that clearly is the strategy, to try to use, find a country, get there, like first with the promise of having a special relation, a special thing, and then from there, try to influence the other. I mean, I think that the situation is so messy right now here that it's not completely clear how that is going to work. But the UK, I think, also wants to do something like that in Asia. I mean, they are looking around, there is the UK has been in Singapore, for example, trying to discuss the possibility of the DIPA, the digital partnership, which is like a completely new cutting-edge type of trade agreement that would completely cut across digital regulation to a level of detail, that would be really problematic when everyone in the world, I mean, if you see the efforts that the European Union is going through to regulate big data and AI. I mean, just the amount of impact assessment and papers and positions and lobbying. And I mean, this is a really complicated thing. I mean, regulating data flows and technology. And you just can't short circuit it, okay, we're going to take this really quick shortcut, just going to agree very quickly on this thing and we are going to fix every problem. And I think that is, I mean, that's the temptation. And I think that the UK, in that sense, is both on the receiving end from the US, but also trying to emulate that. I mean, trying to find other countries where they can open up. And I think being in I think the interesting thing, maybe also for Kenya as well, being in relation to the East African community, being like their main player in the area. I mean, like South Africa, like they are kind of role models, and they definitely see us, they're like mini regional superpowers. And I think that the UK sees itself in this kind of two-sided place as well, no? Like where on the one hand, they think, okay, we can survive dealing with these big ones, but then in exchange for that, we can actually then win a lot with the little ones. No? So like mid-level bullying, basically.
Okay, Lori, what's your take on that? In the meantime, guys, please feel free to write your questions. Like, we are ready to answer your questions. I see 2 questions, but this is a very interesting topic, and we like to hear from you, and we like to answer your questions. But before that, I'll go to Lori. Oh, you are muted, Lori.
There. I think it's dangerous, and we're kind of in a race against time. because you've got these domestic processes, which though, late better than never, the US Congress is now starting to engage in, of concern and starting to fill the regulatory space at the same time that you have the tech industry, but the platforms, but also, a lot of revolving door captured negotiators in the trade agencies of various countries, because obviously the US is getting receptive co-negotiators in too many places, or at least willing, if not receptive, willing partners. There's sort of a race against time to get the shackles on and fill up the space with prohibitions on regulation. I think that, the USMCA, the revised NAFTA, is a really bad example. That digital chapter is dreadful. It was something we just couldn't get the bandwidth to get fixed. We got a bunch of things that no one could imagine would get knocked out of the US trade agreement, like ISDS that was in NAFTA. We got a bunch of stuff taken care of, but we couldn't early enough in the process get up the head of steam to get that dealt with. But that's a bad example, and some of the stuff that's in the TPP is a bad example. But this sort of rush to populate the space by industry, and the effort to basically recruit a carrier, to use the pandemic, analogy, in each region to try and then infect all the other processes, is precisely what's going on. I mean, I think USTR has been trolling around trying to find partners, sort of a coalition of the willing to do these just digital bilaterals, and some efforts to do that. There was an Inside US Trade article that Brazil was on the precipice of agreeing, but apparently Brazil wasn't willing to sign up to the whole kit and the caboodle, so that may or may not happen. But it's a race against time for all of us to figure out how to basically get ahead of that agenda.
I'm going to ask Pablo. Pablo, there is a question. This is a question for Javier, digital partnership. But there is a digital partnership agreement with Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand signed, which is based on the TPP. Can you tell us a little bit about DPA and what is the difference between the TPP and DEPA, and why these countries signed this agreement, and what are Chilean plans for that agreement? Will Chile ask other Latin American countries to join DEPA?
Yeah, so the DPA it's not necessarily a trade agreement, as Pulshu said. It's more a partnership agreement specifically focused on e-commerce, or digital economy, if you want to call it in a broad way. So the idea of the EPA was to be the first digital trade agreement in history. I understand that the United States signed like a couple of weeks earlier an agreement with Japan, so they didn't get the badge of the first digital agreement. And the DPA has a lot of focus on e-commerce, and it replicates a lot of the provisions on TPP, on cross-border data flows and data localization. And I talked with the negotiators in Chile, and the idea was like, okay, so this is going to be the first digital economy agreement, so let's use it as an opportunity to set a good bar regarding e-commerce, and let's show that this can be done in this way. Let's make a better article regarding cross-border, etc. And the thing is, for New Zealand and Singapore, that are also part of TPP, it didn't make any sense. Like, why would we negotiate a different article if we, 3 countries, have already compromised to the TPP level? It doesn't, and they're right, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you compromise to another level of protection if you already signed to TPP? It's going to be applied in the least common denominator. if you're going to have those two provisions as a compromise, well, you still have to comply with TPP. So it didn't make any sense. And I think that's the tragedy, because it was really a good opportunity, because as the first free trade agreement dedicated exclusively to economy, it's going to be a template, or it's going to be at least an influence on every other trade agreement that countries are going to negotiate regarding digital economy. And I also think that there was an opportunity in the EPA regarding issues, and Burcu has listened to me say this a million times, so she's bored, but I haven't said it in this specific forum, that there are a lot of issues that are central to e-commerce that we are not addressing in trade agreements. So for example, why are we not tackling cybersecurity? Why are we not tackling net neutrality? Net neutrality is a condition for e-commerce. How are you going to expand your companies that offer e-commerce services if the local companies can have a deal with their ISPs and traffic in the platforms that don't discount you from your data plan? That's anti-competitive. Cybersecurity, cryptography, banning of backdoors. The ecosystem, the digital ecosystem, is based on trust. And this was included in the EPA. And I think that the EPA in that sense is positive. But at this, and you guys know from intellectual property trade agreements that usually articles that are related to commercial interest are always mandatory. Countries must do this. So for example, the article on cross-border data flows says countries must permit the transfer of cross-border data flows, including data protection, including personal data. So that's a must. But they included these provisions regarding net neutrality, regarding cryptography, regarding cybersecurity, that I think it's excellent, but they did it in the way they always include provisions that regulate the public interest. Countries are going to make efforts, countries compromise on studying, countries are going to collaborate in issues regarding to cybersecurity. So that I think it's something that we should take seriously. We should start thinking of these issues as something that is the cornerstone of discussing how to improve e-commerce. The e-COVID pandemic has shown us how the digital divide is more important than ever, and the digital divide is an issue that has been abandoned for 10 years. And COVID has shown you that with digital divide, there are kids that can continue their education and kids that cannot. And there's people that can continue work and people that cannot, that can't have that opportunity. So why are we not discussing the importance of augmenting the penetration of the internet, or even internet as a fundamental right, on e-commerce regulations? And finally, I know I'm extending a lot. There were certain things that were included in the EPA that I think are very problematic. So for example, Singapore included something related to digital identity, because they have this idea that you should have one digital identity both for the private sector and the government, and people should interact with the government and with their transactions through this unique ID. Okay, so that has a billion of buts, or a billion of problematic issues regarding both data protection and cybersecurity. And there were also inclusions of specific technologies that I think are more like buzzwords. Like they wanted to include them to say, look, we are very technological and we are cutting edge and we are the countries that are on top of things that are very attractive. So they tried to include something regarding, no, they actually included something regarding artificial intelligence, and they wanted to include something related to blockchain, but happily they didn't include it, but they wanted to include blockchain. And blockchain is something that, if you want to believe me, I think it's not going to be implemented for anything except cryptocurrency. So that hype, that inclusion of buzzwords that do not comply with the principle that trade agreements should be neutral from the technological perspective, so that they can endure the passing of time. I think that's something that is troublesome from the DPEA perspective.
Pablo, I have a question. I mean, follow-up question, because I'm going to ask this question to Javier too, because Javier mentioned digital economic partnership and UK is negotiating with Singapore. Like, so, like, do you see like Chile, Singapore, New Zealand going around the world, like including new countries? I mean, I'm particularly concerned like Latin American countries joining the digital economic partnership, because it seems that Singapore is negotiating with the UK on that.
So you asked me, and I didn't respond that. So I don't know if they are actively looking for countries to be part of the EPA, but I know that they are open to the idea that at least countries from Latin America can be included. They have to sign it, and they have to ratify it, and they have to compromise to fulfilling all of the obligations. But I know they are open to the idea that, the same as TPP is open for other countries to be a part of, the EPA also is open. That's the last I heard from the Chilean.
So folks, especially the folks from Latin America, remember, digital economic partnership, that's not good. Like,
for example, Brazil isn't part of TPP, but because they signed the free trade agreement with Chile, is obligated to fulfill TPP articles. So that's
Javier.
I think, basically, it should have mentioned before that the UK is officially considering joining the comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's one of the key, I mean, one of the reasons, and where they're talking openly about that the center of the world has moved to the Pacific. Most of the economy is happening there. And they're quite, I mean, there is a bit unclear exactly how that is going to happen, but the UK is also negotiating trade agreements right now with New Zealand and Australia, and they are just agreed.
But isn't the UK located in the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, you know, it depends how you. I mean, I had a slide, but I didn't use, which was that defying gravity, you know, which is a kind of a trading joke, you know, if you want, but you know, but yeah, the defying gravity models, you know, the UK is going to, you know, they really believe that, that it doesn't matter, you know, there's like a dematerialized service economy, you know, you cannot make anything, you know, anyway, you know, and you have a huge connections with the English language around the world, you know. Some people really believe that you can, that the UK can be in the Pacific as well as anywhere else, you know.
Yeah, when it comes to trade, I think like countries are like, you know, so eager to join this free trade agreement. So there is a question for Laurie. Laurie, could you tell us more on how to shield our countries from those awful just digital trade agreements? This is for you, Laurie.
Yep. Nope. I'm just figuring out how to turn off mute. I mean, it seems to me that with all of these negotiations, there are two strategies. One is an inside strategy that educates the ministries, the officials, the parliamentarians who care about these issues and are doing the domestic work on privacy issues, on data protections, on digital discrimination, etc., to bring them up to speed to help fight the fight internally with, I cannot remember which of my colleagues talked about the silos, but you've got, you know, domestic activity happening on trying to regulate in the space at the same time that in another silo, you have the trade folks basically undermining that capacity. So that is an inside strategy that's really vital. And to some degree, some of it literally is not knowing. I mean, right now, there is a new fight that's getting stirred up in the US between the national security people who are all about the TikTok data localization and the way in which some of the commercial officials are pushing to make that a violation of our trade policies. Those kind of conflicts, basically by merit of educating and let the internal debate happen and see where it settles. The second, and that, you know, can lead to an unwillingness by, or an instruction by trade officials to knock it off. The second approach is an outside approach, and that is to have the public aware. Now, you know, it can be hard in the context of a lot of other cutting edge immediate problems of food security and COVID related economic dislocations. And there's so many urgent catastrophes facing everybody, to be able, as we all know, as people who work on digital issues, as people who work on trade issues, making it about the things that touch people's lives and their personal day to day, as compared to these policies that we're focused on that are underneath the protections, is always a challenge. But to the extent the public could understand the threats and the risks that would be put in place if these policies go forward, the question is it possible to create a political dynamic where it's just not tolerable politically for officials to do that? And it, you know, that's a hard process, but it needs to start. That eventually happened in the US with investor state dispute settlement. It took a lot of work, but we were the belly of the beast for that. I mean, we were the country that was pushing it the most. So it probably took longer to see the counter view from the bottom up than it would in a country that is being the sort of seductee to become later the seducer. But it's not, you know, there's not like a deep value on it the way there was from US investment exporting interests. So that is the inside and the outside, I think, are the best things to do. But in the short term, for both of them, it's just getting the word out, what's being done. I think for a lot of government officials who aren't intimately involved in the trade space, it's just kind of inconceivable that this kind of stuff is being determined in a trade agreement. I mean, we still are finding, you know, pretty sophisticated policymakers in the US who still haven't gotten their heads around it, even though we've been the country pushing it for a decade. You are muted.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Lori. That was really great, and I think it will help many of us, or also our attendees in their advocacy. And there's another question about India. You know, saying that like President Trump visited India very recently, and US is trying to negotiate a free trade deal with India. It's going to be a mini deal, and the government of India is very keen for it for two reasons. China already has a phase 1 agreement with US, and India stepped out of RCEP. But I also know that like there are discussions happening between India and the UK. Before I ask Lori about India-US FTA, I want to ask Javier what's from his perspective from London. And I know that Javier has to go; it's his birthday. He needs to have his birthday party with his family. So after that, I'll let him go. Javier.
So I think with India, I mean, for me, there are three really interesting things with India right now. One, the role that India has taken at the WTO in terms of, you know, the digital trade agenda. That's quite interesting. But then how that cuts across this clear alignment with the US in the global tech war. India just banned a whole tranche of Chinese apps like TikTok and everything, you know, like after the conflict with the Chinese soldiers, there is a demilitarized zone between China and India, where soldiers have no weapons, and somehow without weapons, they managed to basically fabricate bushcraft traps and kill like dozens of each others without any weapons, and like hand-to-hand combat a few months ago. And India has pushed back by attacking the Chinese digital sector, you know, which is a very interesting development, you know, when you think about it. So and it's one of the really key examples of like what the global tech war, you know, like we ban your apps. Now you can access, you know, basically the Apple Store is the kind of, you know, like the battlefield right now. So I think that is really, really interesting. But when it comes to trade and the UK, the other interesting thing is that India is really bringing mode 4 to the table. No? Like we want trade, you know, but we don't want migration. So, well, you know, the EU in a way has already said that, you know, like there are the mantra for the EU is that there are 4 freedoms of the single market, you know, like goods, finance, and people, you know, and service, and that people counts with everything else. No? So if you don't want customs for goods, you also have to let people through. And the UK is really anti-migrant right now. There was a big news the other day was that 2/3 of people of voters in the UK were against the free movement of people like me, Europeans in the UK. They thought that we shouldn't have the right to live here. And the good news is that that was down from 3/4 before the referendum. You know, so that is the, you know, the glass half full thing. So there is, so I don't think that the UK is going to negotiate huge access for Indian people to come to the UK anytime soon. But the new policy that the UK is developing for migration is trying to copy the Australian points system, where, you know, you come in on the basis of your training, education, the jobs needs, people can come from anywhere else in the world. But I don't think that they're going to give, that they're going to sign that kind of.
Okay, so there won't be any UK India FTA anytime.
It means that the Indians are digging their heels quite hard on being able to travel to the UK to deliver services. And that's
okay.
I gotta go now. But
okay,
yeah,
thank you.
great.
Happy birthday! Thank you, Javier. Happy birthday again. Have a great birthday, and say hi to your family, and catch up with you soon. Lori, what's going on? What's happening with US-India mini trade deal?
Well, first for Javier, Feliz. I think that there is probably not going to be a full FTA anytime soon for some of the same reasons, but I think there's an effort by the administration to figure out what partners might do mini deals, and they seem to be more based on geopolitical, conservative bromance dynamics than a lot of other things. So India and Brazil vis-a-vis Trump. But I think that relative to the agreements, I think are imminent. India is in the more sort of medium term as compared to in the next couple of weeks, where, for instance, Brazil could be. And I could be wrong because it's constantly shifting, but that is the dynamic I would suggest. But also I want to be an obnoxious guest on this webinar and suggest that maybe, because for Isaac it's 10:30 at night and I'm watching him being eaten alive by large mosquitoes, but also because I have a 3:30 call, that we might just take a few questions or continue just for a little bit more, and at the half of the hour, maybe wrap. If I may, I will need to hop then.
Yeah, that's my intention too, because it's also very late for Isaac in Nairobi. Isaac, like, I mean, I see that we only have a few minutes left. I can ask for your closing remarks, guys. And there is a very interesting question. I think this will be part of your closing remark, Lori. It's from YouTube, and because they are asking, since Biden is so closely surrounded by white tech bros, what will be the digital future of Latin America be? So, but before that, like, I want to pass the word to Isaac, and I know that Isaac has an important remark to make, and that will be your closing remark, Isaac.
Well, I don't know about important, but I have a remark. This is neither digital trade nor intellectual property, but I think it's really important to mention, because it might actually be a way of getting public interest in this. And there was a New York Times article on August 30th. I'm sure some of you may have read it, but some of you may not. The backstory is that Kenya had put in place a ban on all plastic bags in the country in 2017. So we have no plastic bags apart from no single-use plastic bags at grocery stores and things like that. So I'll just read this real quickly from the New York Times. It says, the world's largest chemical makers and fossil fuel companies are lobbying to influence U.S. trade negotiations with Kenya to reverse its strict limits on plastic, including a tough plastic bag ban. It is pressing for Kenya to continue importing foreign plastic garbage practice it has pledged to commit. Plastic makers are looking beyond the borders of Kenya. We anticipate Kenya could serve as the future as a hub for supplying US-made chemicals and plastics to other markets in Africa through this trade agreement. It sounds as evil as it is, I think, and it's just so depressing. We've put in so much effort. It's kind of like the data protection issue as well. We put in so much effort to put in place a legal regime and then actually enforce it. And now here is the US coming in to do whatever they can to, in their own interest, to get rid of that. So, so kind of a depressing way to end on my side, but I think it's something. I think it's something Kenyans generally like the ban and on plastic, and I think it's something that could be used to rally people against it, the trade agreement. So thank you all, and thanks Burcu for moderating, and thanks to all my co-panelists.
Thank you, Isaac. Good night and enjoy your evening, and we'll talk to you soon. Lori.
So first of all, on what Isaac just mentioned, I think that is a key point to the extent that people who are listening want to try and figure out how to raise attention to the agreement. It's a package. And so if the most pertinent issue isn't the specific digital trade issues that may be your expertise, or the access to meds patent issues that may be your expertise and the reason why you're paying attention to this World Congress, it is, in my experience of a couple of decades of working on trade agreements, you just need to figure out the element that opens people's minds to it. So if in Kenya, it is the plastics ban, and that's something people are experiencing, seeing their pipes clogged up in their neighborhoods flooding because of plastic bags. I mean, those are real direct lived experiences of problems that there's been a solution to, whatever the issue is. It is why, you know, while we always have to be careful, it's not just a thing that can be fixed and it goes away. But the chlorinated chicken issue in the UK is relevant because it's, you know, people worried what they're feeding their kids. And then the whole other package comes with it. So to the extent that the crowbar that opens up people's minds may not be one that looks like the digital issue, it's the way in to be able to raise public alarm about, you know, what sadly can be described really as almost a Trojan horse vehicle. So, you know, trade agreements are called free trade and all smart people should be for it. But today's trade agreements, as we're discussing here, have so many non-trade provisions that are against the public interest and that are even against the structural interests of other participants in policymaking. So legislators don't necessarily want to have permanent super glue on their shoes to the position they're standing in at this moment, or what is their point of existence. So there are ways in that are not just the digital. With respect to all of the tech bros around Biden, it is certainly a point of concern. It is the case that in the Washington, D.C. revolving door between industry and policymaking, for Democrats, the tech sector and Wall Street are the places that these folks are more likely to go as compared to some of the more conservative agribusiness or the chemical industry or et cetera. Not to say there aren't Democrats there, but it's just the culture of those industries of tech and Wall Street are vis-a-vis social issues and even to some degree some environmental issues are more appealing. It's a real problem. And I think it's going to be a knockdown, drag out fight in Congress. One of the things that I think is a very big problem for the Biden administration is if they want to deliver on a bunch of the goals that they have laid out with respect to what they're going to do to fix our economy and to help heal our country, they are going to have to inherently curb some of what the big tech platforms are currently up to. They are not going to be able to have the same old trade agreements, even if there are parts of the Biden camp that either are very cozy with the big tech current ideology or the old trade ideology. He is going to be measured on what he delivers as far as outcomes. And a lot of those rules that those interests have pushed in the past are contradictory to those goals that he wants to achieve with his domestic agenda. And I think that is a reality they're going to have to confront. We're going to have to make that debate very vivid. And I want to thank all of my co-panelists, and Burcu, thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate the opportunity to have learned from everybody a lot. And I did learn a lot more, and I'm now even more upset than I was about this issue. So thank you for Burcu to helping bring me to awareness and introducing me to some of her colleagues. That is helping me understand better in my advocacy to make sure I'm being as effective as possible on this basket of worrisome issues.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. Thanks for taking your time and joining us and sharing your perspective with us. And we will continue working on this issue, folks. And we have Lori Wallach on our side, which is always good because, as she mentioned, same old trade agreements. That's gonna change. So we're gonna change that, but in order to change that, we need your support. So folks, especially the folks in Latin America, be aware of Chile, be aware of Chilean free trade agreements, and also be aware of free trade agreements. And if you want to learn more about digital trade, we have a small alliance. We are all partners of that alliance, Digital Trade Alliance. And we will have more webinars on this issue to educate you, and so that you can educate your policymakers. And before I wrap up, I'm gonna ask Pablo. I named and shamed Chile. I'm so sorry, but it seems that Chile is destroying the data protection regime in Latin America now.
Yeah. So for my closing remarks, I just want to state that we usually tend to see data protection and cybersecurity as two different areas or two different issues. And the reality is that they're deeply entwined. So let's take, for example, Trump's ban to TikTok. Of course, that ban is completely hypocritical and has other reasons, but they say that they're banning TikTok on national security grounds, and they want to protect the personal data of US citizens. That would be completely illegal under TPP provisions. So if the US, and I don't think they're doing it, but they honestly enhance their level of protection as the European Union does, and they want to say, okay, so this means that personal data from US citizens is going to a country as China that does not have an adequate level of protection. So we're not going to let those personal data be exported to China. I think that's completely legitimate. And in the next years, we're going to see an explosion of disputes at the international level regarding cybersecurity. So countries are studying cybersecurity even from the military perspective, because there are already been cyber operations. So cybersecurity from the business perspective, from the international perspective, and then from the human rights perspective, it's going to be every day more important. But data protection is a critical part of cybersecurity. Most cybersecurity attacks are done because the attacker was able to collect personal data from the attacked company, enterprise, or person. So part of cybersecurity is protecting data. And a lot of times the object of attacks regarding cyber attacks is personal data. So what we are seeing is that at the international level, cybersecurity is being every day more important. But what we're not recognizing is that weakening our personal data protection schemes has a direct effect on how we can protect cybersecurity. And I think that relationship is not being created when we discuss these issues.
Thank you, Pablo. Pablo is also a cybersecurity expert, and this leaves us with an important question, why aren't we thinking about cybersecurity? So as I promised to my panelists, I told them that I'm going to wrap up earlier than 3:45, and I'm doing that. I was a little bit ambitious with 3:30. If you have more questions and suggestions, please feel free to get in touch. And as I mentioned, We will be happy to work with you on these issues. Like as IP community, we know the importance of free trade agreements. And as digital rights community, we really, really need to consider trade and trade agreements as essential part of our work, because the agenda is moving really fast, and the trade lobbyists in DC, they are already in this digital, pushing for this digital trade rules all around the world and promoting and lobbying for that. So we need to catch up with them, and we need to be ahead of them. And in order to do this, as Lori mentioned, we need to get the word out. Please get the word out, and please follow us. All of us are happy to hear from you and work with you. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Okay, Pablo. You want to say one thing?
Oh, I was saying goodbye. Goodbye,
Okay.
everyone.
Okay, goodbye. Bye-bye, everyone.